What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with the 10 Deaths of Wolverine. And man, you guys were right about waiting on this and just letting it unfold before I pass judgment on whether or not this is good or bad. This issue makes everything make sense, right? Everything makes sense because of like this one issue. It's kind of weird that it took us 4 issues to get to this point, but it's so amazing. Here's the thing, right? We didn't know, well, in the beginning, we didn't even know if this like phalanx version of Wolverine was even human in the first place, but then we found out that it is Wolverine from the future. But the big question that we had to ask is, why is Wolverine from the future being sent into the past to kill Moira Mactaggert? We assumed that it was because of the idea that Moira Mactaggert at the end of Inferno basically had this plan to essentially prevent mutants from coming into existence, but she was defeated, right? She was basically turned back into a human. So seemingly all of her campaigns and stuff, there was only so much she could do as a human being in order to overthrow the mutant population. But we knew the war between humans and mutants was inevitable at the end of the day, right? Machines were also going to become a part of that. What this does here is this initially opens up with Wolverine and Forge, which is a really, really cool concept because it's kind of a testament, or at least a kind of a throwback, a callback to like the Forge and Bishop relationship from like X-Men the animated series, which I absolutely loved. I spotted this like right off the bat. But essentially what Forge gives Wolverine is a seed for a Krakoan gate, seemingly the last one, right? He calls it their failsafe. He's like, this is our last thing, right? Like this is our last ditch effort, our one shot in order to prevent this future from coming into existence, right? The preserve, mutants being basically wiped from the face of the planet, pushed to the point of near extinction, right? Like the huge mutant and machine and human war that takes place along the line. What Forge ends up doing here, and really kind of with Wolverine's permission, is taking this seed and planting it in his eye. That way it can essentially stay safe, right? Because remember, Wolverine's entire skeleton is adamantium, so you can't just cut his head off and nobody would really even know it was there in the first place. But following that, what he says is like, you have to get out of here. You have to use a time portal. You have to go back to the past. You have to find a way to stop this future from coming into existence. And the only real glimpse that we get is just one of those iconic glimpses that you get over the course of Marvel Comics when you're talking about Days of Future Past or Days of Future Present or something like that, when you basically have the Sentinels descending onto Forge, really, and Wolverine, the last of the mutants seemingly in existence, with the intention of destroying them, right? Forge is just holding things off. And so at that point, you switch over to the far-flung future, right? That the whole scenario with Forge and Wolverine is like the near future, so we can say maybe 50 years from now, whereas the far-flung future is about 1,000 years from now. And Moira Mactaggert here, of course, is one part machine and one part human. And that's when it all really begins to come into play. Because what ends up happening is Wolverine, of course, when he's overcome by Moira Mactaggert and ultimately kind of left for dead, ends up pulling the seed out of his eye and creating the Krakoan gate. And that's what leads to him going back into the past with the intention of destroying Moira Mactaggert. What this does is it basically establishes how the machine war happened in the first place, right? And I know it seems a little ambiguous here. I know it seems a little weird, but bear with me here, right? Because the next scene we get is basically Wolverine alongside Dakin and Gabby and X-23 basically racing towards Arnob Shakladar in order to stop him, right? In order to defeat him. And when they arrive on the scene, essentially Moira Mactaggert's already gone. And when he interrogates him, Wolverine is like, where is she at, right? And ultimately, like, or at least initially, Shakladar refuses to spill the beans. So what he ends up doing, or at least what Wolverine ends up doing, is that where the kids are able to incapacitate Shakladar, Wolverine ends up basically spilling the beans on the fate of his kids, because we didn't know exactly how it was that like Gabby and Laura Kinney and Dakin all died. But what we end up learning is that Dakin is actually the first to fall, that he's killed by the Sentinels when he's completely incinerated by an energy blast. For Gabby, she's actually depowered by Nimrod, right? Her healing factor is shut down and she's ripped in half. But as bad as their fates are, the fate of Laura Kinney is far worse than that, because Laura Kinney is the closest thing anybody has to Wolverine. Because Dakin and Gabby and them, their healing factors aren't necessarily on the same level, but Laura Kinney's essentially is. The fate that's reserved for her is she's tortured and experimented on for years by post-humans. Literally, her organs are harvested, all kinds of stuff, and the way she ends up dying is just by pain, right? Literally, she experiences pain to the point that she ends up succumbing to it and perishes. And like, that's it, right? But she's just used as a guinea pig. And so ultimately, that's when Wolverine is like, that's the fate that awaits them because of what you're doing here and because of what Moira Mactaggert was doing. So where is Moira Mactaggert, right? I swear on my children's graves, if you tell me where she is, I will not kill you. And so when Shakladar dumps the information, Wolverine, and actually a really cool change of pace here, ends up using his phalanx based, or I guess his technological based claws to actually perform a kind of lobotomy on Shakladar, which basically wipes the last, everything from the last 3 issues, or since his original appearance here, wipes all that from his memory. So he doesn't remember anything about like Moira Mactaggert or any of that stuff. Now, here's why this matters, and here's what's actually going on here. So the idea is that with Moira Mactaggert having been defeated at the end of Inferno, we didn't know how the war came about. Essentially, Moira Mactaggert is the basis behind post-humans, that technically the children of the Vault were the first of the post-humans, basically a blending between cybernetics and human beings. But where they were just kind of existed inside their vault, they stayed there, time passed differently, they may or may not have emerged. That when Moira Mactaggert was given the phalanx arm by Warlock, it dawned on her that the only way to ensure the destruction of the mutant race is to basically ensure that the mutant race faces a foe that they simply cannot overcome. That in all the lives that she had lived, that when the war came between humans and mutants, that yes, mutants always lost, but humans were also destroyed as well. But then you had the post-humans. So the idea of Moira Mactaggert is to basically work with Shakladar, or at least was to work with Shakladar, and then find a way to merge human beings and robots together. That's what creates the post-humans in the House of Powers of X storyline, and that's why it is eventually with the phalanx technology and whatnot, they reach out to the phalanx race, and the phalanx race deems them worthy and then absorbs them into the Covenant, right? Absorbs their consciousness basically into a kind of technological hive mind, right? True immortality, as Moira Mactaggert calls it, right? That's literally how all this unfolds. She's ensuring the destruction of the mutant race one way or another. Now, if there were ever any debate as to whether Moira Mactaggert was a good guy or a bad guy, this is laid to rest when she essentially enters through a Krakoan gate. Now, she's not supposed to be able to do that. Remember, humans cannot pass through the gates. Only mutants, only mutants that have a mutant genealogy or mutant genes that are detected can pass through it. What you end up finding out here is that she had basically killed Sean Cassidy, right? She killed Banshee and then stripped the skin off his body and then put it on herself and then used that to pass through the Krakoan gates. I mean, that's just diabolical, man. Like, that's just brutal, right? I mean, maybe it was kind of a throwaway thing because she's kind of like, well, I mean, he can always be resurrected. But even then, right, throwing away a life in such a crass manner is just, there's no room for remorse there, right? No room for redemption. There's no way to look at that and to argue that there's anything about it that's beneficial. Now, in terms of why she's here, the real motivation is that from her perspective, on the off chance that Shakladar will ultimately be found, will be captured, and then will end up divulging her information, that she wanted a backup plan. And so her idea was if the gun of Forge, right, the neutralizer gun, had the ability to basically shut down the powers of anybody that's hit with its blast, then her thought was it can be reversed. The problem is when she gets her hand on this gun, Xavier appears to her and is like, look, that's not going to work the way that you think it is. One, like, you can still leave here, right? You can still walk away. We have a lengthy history together. I believe in Krakoa. Even if you don't, I believe this mutant island can actually serve a beneficial purpose aside from just breeding mutants so that they will ultimately be born with no powers, essentially just like creating generation after generation after generation of mutants, each of which has fewer powers than the last, to the point where there basically are no mutants whatsoever, that there has to be something better than that. But even if you don't necessarily believe that's the case, because of our history, like, we can just let you go, right? Like, you can just leave. I'm giving you a peace offering. More so than that, I can give you Krakoan medicines that will cure you of your cancer. Moira Mactaggert, I'm giving you a second chance at your life. You're not immortal, right? Like, that gun is not going to work the way that you think it will. It will not return your powers to you. So if you stay here, you will die, and that will be the end of you. If for nothing else, think of our history and leave this place. But ultimately, because she refuses to, she's ambushed by Forge. Now, the kicker to this is that she uses her weapon on Forge and strips Forge of his powers. Now, here's the thing about this, right? Forge, being a mutant, can basically be resurrected. But if for some reason he can't, then Krakoa loses their version of Tony Stark. Because remember, the power of Forge is that he basically is Tony Stark. He's exceedingly intelligent when it comes to like engineering, machinery, all that kind of stuff, right? Like, he's the mutant version of Iron Man. But if he has no powers, he cannot be that guy. The technological advancements that have been made in Krakoa so far all go up in smoke. They just disappear because he's no longer there anymore. Not only that, once she makes her escape and basically bails, she ends up just kind of donning a sort of suit of armor on herself, right? Just using a bit of Krakoan tech at her disposal that can really just kind of be used by anybody. But in the middle of all this, Wolverine suddenly jumps back, after coming through the portal, leaving Shacklidar behind, and immediately seizes after control of Moira Mactaggert. But Moira Mactaggert, knowing that her fate is basically sealed, knowing that she's seemingly going to die here, ends up drawing the neutralizer, or the power neutralizer, and then fires it at Wolverine. And when that happens, it shuts down his healing factor. Now, under normal circumstances, that wouldn't matter. But remember, Wolverine's currently bonded with Phalanx tech, and his healing factor is the only thing that kept that Phalanx tech from basically bonding it to himself. This is incredibly important because what this looks like is this Benjamin Percy saying that future with like the human, machine, and mutant war, and then humans basically working with machines in order to turn themselves into post-humans and then eradicate mutants in their entirety, that's a guaranteed outcome. Before, it was because of Moira Mactaggert and Shacklidar. Now, it's because the Phalanx has totally taken over Wolverine, and now that machine component dominates. And assuming that the will of Moira Mactaggert is the will of the Phalanx, then it will most likely spread and end up incorporating humanity into itself and forming post-humans anyway, while simultaneously wiping out the mutant population. I am excited to see where this goes. Yeah, so thank you guys. Great call. I love this. This is one reason why I love you guys so much. You guys are so good. You guys are just like, no, Rob, I know you're not really feeling it. Just wait for it. Normally that's what I do, but with everything going on with X-Men, it's after Hickman left, I'm like, I don't know how I feel. But thank you guys, right? You guys have been a godsend and telling me to hold off. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.